Welcome to the HC Commodities Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. This podcast is produced by HC Group, a global search firm dedicated to the commodities sector. Today we're talking the Brazilian power market. Unique in terms of the contribution of renewables, particularly from hydro, the market's also been rapidly deregulating over the last 20 years, opening up opportunities across the value chain spectrum, particularly for traders. How is the market set up and what does its future hold? Our guest is Adriana Waltrick, CEO of SPIC Brazil, which is the fifth largest energy generator in the country, with generation assets across thermal, renewable and hydro. Just a quick apology for the poor quality of the audio. We didn't realise until we'd finished recording, but the conversation was so interesting that I didn't want to not post it. Just a reminder, we have an HC Commodity Podcast live event coming up in Houston on September the 19th, focused on US natural gas trading in a global market. The event is free, but RSVP only. I'll include links in the show notes. We still have some places left, so if you're in town for GasTech or in town normally, we'd love to see you there. And as always, please do leave us a positive review on the platform you're listening on, as it really helps the show. Okay, well, Adriana, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we are talking the Brazilian power sector, which there'll be some familiarities for some participants around the world and other quite unique aspects, not least the contribution of renewables in Brazilian power in the generation overall. But can you just give us a short overview of a bit of the history of the Brazilian power sector and some of the key factors about it today?
Thank you, Paul, for this question. Let's start by introducing the Brazilian power sector as a sector that has been privatized. And so we have experience of free markets for 20 years now. Putting that back into context, Brazil has done a transition to a more stable economy during the 90s. And at the end of the 90s, 97, 98, you see the whole wave of privatizations, including the power sector. From then on, around 2002, we have started to model the energy sector in Brazil. And since then, it's been around 20 years. We do have a trading market, an energy trading framework, and we have roughly 90% of our sector now privatized, both in generation, transmission, and distribution companies. The trading business is basically owned by mostly by private companies. So that's a 20-year history of a sector. Now we are putting together a lot of new ideas for a restructuring of the sector. And more, Brazil will have a free market of electricity. So we expect that the high tension customers are all free in 2024, and the lower tension customers, a good scenario would be around 2028. So then by that time, everyone will be able to choose its electricity supplier, what is the best price, what are the best conditions, and what are the better marketing equations to each and every customer. So This is just a highlight of what we have here in Brazil as the electricity sector.
Yeah, fantastic. And we're going to come on to how the market is structured today with the generators, the transmitters, and then obviously the free participants in terms of, qualifying to be able to buy power off the market, the free traded market as opposed to the regulated, and what the future might hold. Just can you set us up? It is relatively unique around the world, the generation mix that it's in Brazil. Can you give us some sense of what that is and how that indeed then introduces different dynamics in terms of power generation volatility in response to things like weather, drought, and so forth?
Indeed, that's very specific for Brazil. Brazil has a supply mix, electricity coming from hydro power plants around 53%. wind 12%, biomass and solar another, solar 4%, biomass other 8%. Then we have a new segment, which is the distributed generation, which is the solar rooftops. That has already a 9% participation in our market. But very important is that you see that the fossil fuels participate not more than 5 or 6% in our market, both oil and coal. Then we have natural gas participating of 8%. Having said that, our system is highly dependent on the water that is in the reservoirs of these 53% hydropower plants supplying to the grid. So that makes our trading very unique in terms of its volatility, in terms of structural and intraday volatility, because of the composition of our supply mix.
Yeah, can you give us, because that is just staying on the hydro piece, which is obviously the biggest contributor, can you give us some sense of the volatility? And obviously the backdrop to this as well for listeners is that Brazil has gone through some severe droughts over the last 5 years or so. Can you give us some sense of that magnitude and kind of what the response is?
So when we talk volatility, we must separate volatility into different parts. One is intraday, the volatility that we have hour by hour, and the other is the seasonal volatility, which has to do a lot of months of the year. So let's start with the seasonal volatility. Because we have a hydro and thermal basis in our country, so when we don't have firm load from the hydropower plants, we do inject the thermal power plants because renewables are intermittent. So we need those two to act together. Therefore, it's not easy, but it's very determined, the dry and humid months of the year, which is so very much expected, the structural volatility, which has to do with dry and humid months of the year. This is very common as it is in countries that have hydro system, very, very high participation, such as Colombia, the Nordic countries in Europe, New Zealand. In terms of intraday, that has to do with a lot with the future price of the water in the system. And that has a lot to do with several phenomena. The future cost of the water in the system has to do with how much renewables we have today, dispatching and participating in the system. It has to do a lot with instant demand. How is the demand developing? And for that part, Brazil has an average volatility in terms of the world. Just to give you some examples, Brazil has 2.5 churn in terms of liquidity versus the load in the system. US has roughly 4 times that same measure of churn. Europe, for example, 4.5 to 6. So Brazil has average volatility in terms of the intraday business and dynamics. I know it's very complex to explain, but I try to give you a very short summary of a very complex item.
Yeah, so there is a certain amount of planning you can do around that hydro. But am I right in thinking that there has been these severe droughts? How much pressure did that put on the generation load in general, and what happened then?
Yes, this is a very interesting question because we are having a very severe drought, one of the biggest ones in the history, similar to what we had in 2021. But you see that the price is very low in the free market. Why is that? Something very interesting is happening is that the participation of the renewables is very active. So, and we also have reservoirs that are still full from last year. So if the drought continues for the next year, so then we probably have an energy price spike or several spikes. As of today, what we are seeing is a structural surplus of energy. So we have much more offer than we have demand, and demand is low. Brazil is not growing as expected. Therefore, the structural prices are still very low if you take the drought that we are facing. The intraday, we might have some spikes at certain hours when renewables are not totally being dispatched because of lack of sun or lack of wind. And therefore, we might have some hourly spikes. But structurally speaking, because we have distributed generation and water in the reservoirs, is still around 60-65% full reservoirs. Because of that, prices are not considered in a high level. We might just have some hourly spikes, which is normal because of the intermittency of the renewables.
Yeah. Staying on renewables and staying on generation, was this sort of government-directed policy? Obviously, the generation side remains regulated to an extent, to build this renewables capability, or was this purely a function of economics and technology and the nature of Brazil's huge expanses?
The renewables part has to do a lot with the free market nowadays. So it used to be regulated auctions, but now the majority of solar and wind farms are based on free market PPAs. Therefore, when everyone started to develop their own projects, mostly at northeast and center of Brazil, what happened is that, we find two things. A surplus of offer because everyone is offering together because of the prices of the solar panels that have populated our sunny northeastern region. But we also saw another factor, which is transmission, a lack of capacity for all those wind and solar farms. And now what we are facing in some regions, and this is hurting some generators, is a curtailment due to transmission, to lack of transmission lines for the interconnection between South and Northeastern. So that's a phenomenon that is going on very severely this year, especially in some states of Northeast, such as Bahia and Ceará, Piauí also. But that's something temporary. It does represent a new risk in our sector when we do not have a centralized planning of what we are developing. It's not more regulated by energy auctions. Now it's the free market dynamics. And so the risk of the entrepreneurs is growing higher. And one new risk that we did not know is this of the curtailment or constrained off when the system operator asks you to not dispatch. You see, the megawatt is centrally dispatched by the system operator, but the contracts are not. So that's the difference in Brazil. So your contracts will have to forecast what will be the behavior of the system operator. In our case, for example, we do have some solar farms that are not being dispatched in certain days, around 50%. And for that, we do have two challenges. One is financial. You need to find revenues to pay your bills, which are OPEX, CAPEX, and funding. But you also need to buy energy to supply to your PPAs because you already sold that energy. So those are the new risks of this new free market that we are now working with new dynamics. So it's a totally new way of seeing the sector from the last 20 years that I mentioned to you from now on.
Yeah. And I imagine, therefore, lots of data centers are going to be popping up around these unused solar farms.
They do.
So and one final piece before we sort of get on to how the market was structured and the big changes that are happening. Natural gas is 8%. where does that, because we've also seen lots of interest from LNG participants and so forth in Brazil. Where does that gas come from? How has that market developed?
Our gas can come from, it can be LNG. In our case, we have the largest South American thermal power plant by natural gas. So it comes from LNG all over the world. We have an FSRU that is stationary in that region of Rio de Janeiro. And from there, we buy gas from everywhere. There is a very interesting perspective that we'll have more offer of natural gas coming from the domestic market and coming from the pre-salt area in the southeastern coast of Brazil, and also from the equatorial margin near the Guianas in the north of Brazil for the future. So we do have some domestic availability that will increase in the future. And many of us are working with gas coming from other areas of the world, from anywhere, basically.
The energy and resources sector is experiencing unprecedented change. To help companies navigate this world and capture its opportunities, HC Group launched Enco Insights in 2023. Enco has rapidly become the leading global expert network dedicated to energy and resources. Enco Insights leverages HC Group's 20 years of connections and dedication to the sector to give clients the expertise they need to take decisions fast. Connect with Enco's experts for anything from a 1-hour insight call to a longer-term consulting project at encoinsights.com.
So let's move on to the market. So, HC Group, and we obviously know each other through the work that we've done down there with Andrew Watson and his team based in Sao Paulo, and we've been active in placing power traders and associated skill sets for about a decade, really. So as it was, as I understand it, you had obviously the generators, you then had this governmental body that was regulated dispatch transmission piece, and then you had the distributors that then sell on to the customers, and the distributors would essentially be a regulated market in how they would buy that power from the generators. But there was this sort of class of customers that if you were above, a certain amount of consumption, 2 megawatts, and then, you'll be able to provide the details, you could start participating in the free market. Is that right? And can you just help us understand that much better than I just described it?
The segments of generation is very much nowadays free market dynamics. Of course, there is a lot of older contracts that we all manage, but the growth from now on, if not hydropower plants, which are concessions, therefore regulated, mostly renewables, they are all free market. Thermal power plants are also mostly authorizations or concessions, but also regulated. But the growth is really coming from the free market. Transmission and distribution is what we call the wire part of our system. That's very regulated. They are concessions and come from concessions or authorizations by the federal government, therefore very regulated. At the end of this spectrum, we have the last mile, which are the customers and the free market. And that's where trading comes. So we have two pieces, generation growth of renewables and the trading, which is the last mile, pretty much unregulated or free market. And in the middle, you have the megawatt dispatch and the wire system, which is very regulated. So you must, as a player, put all that in a puzzle and try to make your models and your logic to be able to forecast the future behavior of all these pieces working together. And also, what is the cost of the water in the future, which is very much conditioned to the way that the country grows, to the way that the rain comes to the right areas where the reservoirs are, and how the renewables will be dispatched and interact with this whole scenario. Having said that, in that area of renewables and their dispatch, we need to be very careful on how they will transit to the consumer markets. Sometimes we will find curtailment, and therefore that should come into your equation. It's a long answer to your question, and I'm trying to be clear. I hope I'm being clear about the dynamics.
Just staying on that last mile, who is trading, and who has access to that trading system, and how exactly is price determined? What are the kind of nature of contracts that are traded?
Yes, our trading system is very open to all traders. So we have more than 100 traders in Brazil that are very active. So a free client can go to the traders, or if you are big enough and you have scale, you can also go directly to the generators. If you have an area to manage your energy requirements, you can go yourself and buy directly from a generator. A free customer has two ways of doing it. There are the retail traders that go to the smaller customers, the residential customers, and there is also the wholesale traders that do sell larger amounts of energy. So the price of energy is calculated every day on an hourly basis by CCEE, which is the Energy Chamber of Commerce. And just as an idea, we have a floor, which is the minimum spot price, and we have a maximum structural, and also in terms of month, and also a maximum in terms of hour. Just to have an idea, our floor price for the spot market is 61 reais per megawatt hour, and we can have a structural maximum of around 716 reais per megawatt hour, but hourly it can go to a top as a cap of 1,470 reais per megawatt hour by the hour. So you see that we have a higher cap by the hour, and during the month we have a lower cap. And that's because of the duck curve that we have because of renewables. Some hours will be very high when there is no sun, no wind, and we have to dispatch thermal power plants. Therefore, the cap is much higher at the hourly times.
Bit of math. It's $12 to $200 or so, right? Roughly speaking, on those caps.
Yes, around that.
Firstly, before I ask what sort of recently changed in this setup, is there, what has a liberalized power market brought to Brazil? Has it unlocked this investment you spoke of earlier in things like renewables, in more generation? Has it ultimately done what it's designed to do by introducing competition, lowered power prices for your average consumer? What is is this politically perceived as a positive, and what has it achieved?
What we have seen basically is, yes, margins have been lower because of competition. That's for sure has happened. And what we saw is that most of the traders, they're verticalizing to have some generation assets, especially renewables like solar, in the free market. So what they're to dispatch to the free market. So what we are seeing is that traders are not just traders now. They are also investors in generation, especially smaller scale generation, to have some certainty of a part of their sales. So what we see is that, traders pretty much said, if I'm not verticalizing, the margins will be so low that we need to amplify our business in the value chain. So what we are seeing is a trend of traders also investing in solar panels and distributed generation, or even some centralized generation to dispatch in smaller pieces to different types of free clients. And that's a rush for larger margins because, yes, margins have diminished a lot at least in the last 4 to 5 years.
Yeah. There's also been, though, at the same time, and I guess this was driven by periods of really high volatility, some extraordinary results from some power trading teams, right? Phenomenal profits generated, I guess, when they've been well set up, they've got the capacity, the digital infrastructure, the platforms to actually take advantage of those periods of really high volatility. So this has also been quite a lucrative backdrop for some traders.
That's correct. Well, it's very interesting because the traders had models and they knew how to help customers much better than distributors, than just plain generators. So yes, they knew how to deal with the last mile. They have that specializations, and they also had very good financials to be able to invest. And yes, you're right, and therefore it was natural when you see your margins get lower, just to invest in the value chain that you already know and verticalize backwards. So that's what we are seeing as a trend.
I sort of described a bit of more of a historical view of how it was set up. What has changed in the last couple of years, that is accelerating this liberalisation? You mentioned about, it really has gone to a free market at that last mile. Can you just give us some backdrop to that? And also, I guess as well, it's important to note that this legislation has survived different political parties as well, right? There seems to be some consensus, albeit with lots of uncertainty and worry at certain points. But essentially, we've had this consistent drive to liberalisation. And can you speak to what's recently happened?
We saw some interesting trends. For example, we are seeing the commercial banks that have a lot of retailing contact with different types of customers, widespread in the whole country. They are also becoming energy traders. So you will see in Brazil the larger banks such as Itaú, such as BTG, they have very good energy trading desks. And they can reach the last mile very easily. So they are pretty much positioning themselves to the future, in my view. Another thing that we are seeing is that the oil companies are now investing in renewables. And when you invest in renewables, you also want to have the commercialization part of it. So we also see the oil companies trading in the electricity business in Brazil and also looking for the future. We saw many partnerships being done with renewable companies and oil companies, or traders with electricity traders being joined by oil and gas companies. And so that's one part of the whole change that we are seeing. And then, of course, it will be much more competitive. We do have right and left wing in the Brazilian politics, but it seems that both agendas for the electricity sector have the tendency, the trend of liberalization in the last mile. And we expect that will be good for consumers, especially at times when we have energy surplus, like now. And on the other times where we have scarcity and much more pricing, then we have the caps of the market, which do not make the situations too extreme for customers. So what I see is that, yes, much more competition, new players, and governments willing to do that for the benefit of the consumers, and also the bringing new competition dynamics to this important segment of the economy, which in turn also conditions the competitiveness of the country. So it seems that the whole strategy of government and also players are converging to the free market.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, it also spurs that foreign investment. We have seen, European utilities. You mentioned the oil majors all coming into Brazil, and they're either coming in, as you say, through that the renewables piece, but then they need the risk management of trading arms, or now increasingly with natural gas, you're seeing the oil majors coming in, and they want to have access to that downstream market as a hedge, and therefore they're building trading teams. What do you see as we talk today? What are any recent developments in terms of deregulation and what's on the horizon? For example, you mentioned you've got quite a powerful regulated transmission, which has a significant impact. Is anything going to change there? Like, what does the next 2 to 5 years hold in terms of planning around the power market in Brazil?
Well, we are seeing a lot of regulations towards batteries, towards green hydrogen, towards offshore wind. And so we are seeing a preparation for those segments. So that's in near future, in my view, end of this decade. So we will see more of those. We are also seeing a trend for reversible hydropower plants. So lots of studies on that, and so maybe a new source of energy. We are seeing regulations for hybrid generation farms. So if we have a hydropower plant, we should put solar there, or even batteries, or even wind. So we are seeing much more of a mix of energy production systems put together and a regulation that accompanies that. So that's for the offer side. So on the demand side, what we are seeing is our government implementing a new industrialization plan in Brazil with basically 3 different verticals. One is digitalization, where the country will favor the data centers coming to Brazil, and they are very high energy consumers. We also have vertical of energy and natural resources in this new plan, and also agricultural and biotechnology. And so we'll see more and more government programs bringing new demand to the country through new competitiveness and new industrialization plans. And that will be translated by new funding, new private-public partnerships, and those will be industrial of new energy consumption, we believe. And that Brazil needs to bring more dynamism to its economy. We are growing roughly 2% every year, and that's very low for an emerging economy. Therefore, we expect some more dynamism in our economy, which will be translated to a higher GDP, and with that, higher energy consumption. As of today, for each 1% of GDP, we have 1.5% of energy consumption growth. Therefore, we will see more of that. We do need not just overperforming offer of energy, but we also need a dynamic economy and economic growth to be able to absorb those initiatives in the energy side and all the innovations in the energy side.
Yeah. Just one comment. What are reversible hydro plants?
They are hydropower plants in which, during times when you have water, you pump the water to some storage, and when you need that water, you bring it back and generate energy. So it's called pump storage hydropower plants. It's when you pump the water back up to a reservoir when you have excess of energy and water. And then when you have scarcity, you have that water to come down and produce new energy.
So that's where the renewables come in. You could use that.
Oh, yes. When you have low cost of energy, it makes sense to pump your water back and use it during other times. It would be like a battery to the system in a way.
It's been fascinating just to end up, because one crucial element that we haven't really spoken about yet is obviously the people and the talent side. This has been quite a rapid development of a market in terms of number of participants, number of demand for traders and all of those associated disciplines. Some organizations have gone down the route of bringing senior leadership in from other regions where there are, other countries where there are established power markets. Can you give me some sense of how is Brazil meeting this talent demand, which is obviously quite fierce in power across the spectrum?
So now what we need in terms of HR, I believe in the sector, is people that know the history and the structures of the energy market, but also can understand and manage a risk for the future in a very volatile future with all the new variables that we are going to see. So what we basically need is people that has specialization in risk management and understand how we model risk and how we manage risk. But not only that, you need to know what is the other part of the same coin, the other half of the same coin, which is the structure of the energy sector in Brazil. Because the whole part of the regulated market of the legacy contracts that we have, they will not disappear. So you need to manage the past and the future. And so we need the both competencies, one that understands regulation and the other that can manage risk as do the financial markets. So when you find those two together, I believe you can have a successful management of your energy business in Brazil.
Yes, perfect. Well, Adriana, it's been fascinating. I'm sure it's going to generate a lot of questions and interest from a global power trading audience and commodity audience beyond. And it's great to cover. So thanks very much for coming on. Hopefully we can have you back on in a year or two and see how the market continues to develop.
Yes, I'll be looking forward to that. I thank you very much, Paul, and see you soon sometime.
Thank you for listening. To find out more about HC Group, our global offices, and our expertise in search within the commodities sector, please visit www.hcgroup.global.